Today on Market Journal, can we blame the groundhog for this one? What about the polar vortex? We'll see what this extreme winter weather means for farmers and your planting preparations. The release of some backlogged cattle reports could be causing you information overload. We'll hit the major points and break down the numbers with our analyst. Agricultural production accounts for more than a quarter of Nebraska's workforce. Our ag economist is here with a new study to talk about ag labor, farm debt, land permits, and more. This week's edition of Market Journal starts right now.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hey everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Good to see you. We've made it to March. Doesn't quite feel like it though, and like many others, you may be asking yourself, when is this winter going to end? Well, March 1st was the first day of what's known as meteorological spring. We're still about another week away before temperatures in many parts of the state tick up closer to where we'd expect them to be. So it's safe to say the 2018-2019 winter season will go down as one we're going to remember. One reason for the cold, and you've probably heard this weather term before, the polar vortex. I spoke with DTN senior ag meteorologist Bryce Anderson about that and other agricultural impacts from this harsh winter.
Well, the polar vortex is basically a description for just a real cold bubble of air that from time to time breaks away from the Arctic region during a winter when the prevailing winds at the high latitudes are a little bit weaker than typical, and we had that happen here during this winter. That cold air plunged southward, and it certainly led to a very harsh cold wave during the end of January and the first part of February over the eastern half of the U.S. And in our opinion, the focus of that cold air bubble has now moved to the western part of North America, and it stayed around through much of the last couple weeks to where we had cold enough conditions that it snowed in Las Vegas, Nevada, and even around Phoenix, Arizona over the last 10 days or so. And that's helped to drive more winter storms pretty much across the central and eastern parts of the country. So it's had a real lasting effect on our winter patterns so far, and it's kept things on a mighty cold note throughout the last half of the season.
And what are the impacts agriculture has seen and will see from it?
Well, I think that we've seen certainly a real harsh effect on transportation. It has affected this cold and the winter wind conditions and winter storm conditions. Snowfall and freezing precip have all combined to hurt the transportation scene. We've seen some local areas where the cash grain basis has had to strengthen because simply of a lack of available grain, and so it's been more difficult from that side of things with keeping grain transport going. But then also the impact on livestock has been, I think, quite terrific. I've visited with livestock producers in the plains who've had just a terrible winter, relatively speaking, in terms of feed conversion for feedlot cattle because it's been cold and wet. And now we get into spring calving season or late winter, spring calving time frame, and that's been a very stressful time as well because it simply has been cold, windy, wet, snowy, and that's caused issues from that standpoint. Along with that, Troy, it's interesting to note that, you know, the hay supply from last year has really been drawn down quite substantially by this cold weather. And so as a result, when we come into the springtime here in 2019, there's not quite as much hay available as one might think of, because there's been a lot of hay that's had to have been fed over quite a large area because it's been so cold.
And Bryce, I know a big question people are asking is, when is this going to let up? Because I know field work is something that is on people's minds over the coming weeks. So what news do you have for them?
The scenario is not looking too favorable for just a complete turnaround in this weather pattern over the next couple weeks at least. Our forecasts have a definite below normal trend on the temperature outlook all the way into the March 10th weekend time frame. Now, during the last half of March, it does appear that the pattern is going to modify a little bit, but it's still going to be pretty slow. I mean, when we get this kind of a cold pattern set in late winter, and then when we add the kind of snowfall that we've seen to that, I mean, we've had record or near record amounts of snow for the entire winter season in much of eastern Nebraska because of this late winter snow that we've had. That takes time to melt, and obviously that then takes time for the temperature pattern to moderate a little bit. And so it does mean that winter is going to hang on, and spring is going to be a slow season to actually begin. It's going to be a very reluctant transition from winter to spring this year.
And since we've had a lot of snow on top of already wet soil, do you think flooding will be a concern once we warm up? I
think flooding concern is very high, and flood risk is higher than average. It certainly is just a lot higher than a year ago. When we're looking at soil moisture profiles, all the way from the Central Plains in Nebraska and Kansas east clear to the New Jersey coastline. So we're talking about much of the plains and just about all of the Midwest. The soil moisture supplies are at close to the 99th percentile over this entire part of the continental U.S. And so that means that the soil moisture situation is already almost at saturation level. And now we add to it a very heavy snowpack, and add to that the likelihood of some springtime rains, which is a pretty good bet at this point. I think that we are going to see a notable round of flooding this season, and it could be quite severe depending on how the snow melt acts. If we get a lot of melting of snow before the ground completely thaws and is able to have that moisture percolate into the soils, we're going to see a pretty notable round of flooding, and I think that is a much higher risk this year.
Still ahead, Al Dutcher will be here a little later in the show to give us a closer look at what's in our full forecast. One thing that hasn't been cold is employment in Nebraska. Recent findings from the United States Department of Labor show statewide unemployment at only 2.8%, tied for 7th with Virginia and Minnesota. Nebraska Extension ag economist Jim Jansen came on the show to discuss a new report that examines some current Nebraska economic conditions and how it relates to the ag industry.
Many folks that choose to work in the ag industry have some kind of a fixation to the industry, whether they grew up in an area, they like the type of work, they like the profession they're in. When we look at retaining these quality individuals, we got to ask ourselves beyond the paycheck, what do we need to do to keep these people here? Some folks it's health insurance, some folks it's a degree of pay. Some people I've even had quoted to me that they're looking for a place to live. If you're a farm operator and you have an extra acreage or a farm site of some kind, by allowing one of your hired individuals to live there, would that be incentivize them to stay? So keep in mind the area that you live in, and relative to the area, what does employment look like there?
And what were some of the figures that stuck out to you in this report? I know that payroll employment was one. If you want to talk about that one first.
Yeah, so related to the major sectors in the overall economy, it appears that construction, the manufacturing, professional services have continued to increase over the prior year. Construction is very active in many areas in the metros. They're building new homes, new buildings, new stores, whatever it might be. Manufacturing, many areas in the state also have a fairly robust manufacturing sector. as well as there were other sectors that were noted a little bit minor to that related to government employment. So whether it's with federal, state, or local government. Areas across Nebraska outside the ag sector appear to be fairly favorable in terms of overall employment in the state.
And then in another report, the Federal Reserve says that non-real estate farm debt continues to increase. What do you see as the driving force behind that, and what can farmers do?
So when we talk about non-farm real estate loans, these would be things like revolving or non-revolving line of credit, the more short-term lending, we might say. We've seen a gradual increase over the last year related to current debt, things like that. What this is looking at is when, as a farm operator or a ranch operator, we may not have as much liquidity in our operations in terms of having cash, and that's why we're starting to rely on financial institutions to provide short-term lending. The thing I encourage folks to look at, if you are taking out that type of debt, what kind of interest rates are you paying? And in addition to the interest rates, make sure you are spending your resources on things you need. Maybe you got to reassess where we're at. I think we can still make things work out in our current ag economy, but we need to be prudent in what we're spending it on.
And I know that there were a couple other graphs and charts you wanted to talk about, some major findings from that report. I know delinquency rates at commercial banks, that was one that really caught your eye.
So delinquency rates, yes, the overall amount of loans are increasing in the state of Nebraska related to non-real estate or non-ag land loans. But the delinquency rate still remains near historical lows. So that goes to show, my professional opinion would probably say that we're writing the loans, we're underwriting them at a very solid credit standards, meaning when we lend money out, we're lending at it in a manner that's appropriate for the type of loans that we're making. And the other thing that stood out to me is current interest rates. Interest rates, especially on short-term debt over the last year or two, have increased to an extent related to our operating or our non-current short-term lending. Things that when we make a loan to put in a crop, if we buy livestock, things like that, we're seeing a gradual increase for those types of debt.
And the report also talks about the value of irrigated cropland. I thought this was pretty interesting. So Nebraska had a pretty big change, value dropping by 5%. What are we seeing there?
So the Kansas City Federal Reserve monitors various types of land classes is what we term them here at the University of Nebraska. Related to that, they noted a decline of around 5% compared to the prior year for the overall state. Surrounding states were down several percent as well. What makes a lot of people in the ag sector concerned about declining ag land values, ag land tend to make up the biggest portion of our balance sheet, whether it's related to lending, whether it's related to going out and acquiring something, or a store of wealth. That being said, we need to be observant of what's happening in the land industry. I don't think it's the end of the world if we're seeing a decline, but related to that decline, it's healthy to see a gradual decline that reflects the underlying fundamentals of the ag economy. Corn, soybeans, livestock prices, the things that we're raising on our great land that we have here in the state are starting to be reflected into it. We like to see gradual changes in our asset values compared to dramatic. Instead of 5%, 25%.
Sure.
Some of our viewers are watching today probably echo some of these double-digit declines of the 1980s. I don't think we're to that point. I think we might see a gradual decline over time, but over time it allows us as ag producers as well as agribusinesses to change our decision-making and reflect that into our lending practices.
The information that Jim was referencing in that story came from the Ag Finance Data Book and the Nebraska Economic Data Book. They're issued by the Kansas City Federal Reserve, which compiles various reports for states in the 10th District, and that includes Nebraska. On to our market segment now, and our livestock analyst will join us in just a moment. Have you had a chance to look through the slate of cattle reports the USDA released late last month? We'll check on some of the highlights. The supply of market-ready cattle this spring may not be quite as analysts had hoped. We'll tell you why. And it's getting close to the time of year to talk about risk management strategies. Here's some ways to get started. A couple weeks back, we went through some of the USDA's recently released grain reports. Time to do that with the new cattle reports now. And Dr. Josh Maples is here to help us analyze the numbers. He's an assistant professor and livestock extension economist with Mississippi State University. Josh, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Troy. Happy to be here.
So I was hoping you could take a second to catch us up on these reports that were delayed because of the government shutdown. So could you remind us what was released and what this information attempts to tell us?
Yeah, so we're in the middle of kind of an unprecedented amount of information that's about to hit the markets in a really short period of time. So last week we got the January cattle on feed report, and so this was telling us about placements and marketings during December. This week, last day of February, we're going to get the annual cattle inventory report. So this is a highly anticipated report. It's going to tell us about cattle inventory by state, by class, and it also is going to give us that total cattle on feed number, not just for the larger feedlots like we get each month. And then finally, next week, we're going to get the February cattle on feed report. And again, all three of these have been delayed because of the shutdown, but it's leading to a scenario where we're going to get a lot of information in a really short period of time.
And all that being said, I'd like to get your thoughts on some of the info that was released. Let's start with the placement numbers. What are we seeing here?
Yeah, so the placements number was the surprise out of this last report. So the January report shows us placements during December of 2018. So placements came in about 2% lower than a year ago, so lower than December of 2017. And this was surprising because the average expectation was for that number to be about 2% higher. So it seems that weather and then muddy feedlot conditions and among other things kept placements a little lower than we might have seasonally expected.
And what were some other things you saw that you'd like to bring our attention to?
Yeah, so I think the combination of that lower placement numbers with some lower placement numbers in the reports prior to that one are really worth looking at. So this was the fourth consecutive month that we saw lower placement numbers than the previous year. And if you kind of put all that together, that is going to affect the supply of market-ready cattle this spring. And then it's also going to probably suggest larger placements into feedlots in the spring months. So cattle that didn't get placed during the October, November, December months are probably going to come through during the spring months. And it seems like the futures market is really paying attention to this. There's a pretty wide spread between the April live cattle contract price and then especially late summer, like the August live cattle contract price, as traders are looking at when the supplies may be coming through.
Does this new information change any of your predictions for what we could see in the beef sector for the first half of 2019 and beyond?
Yeah, so this particular report really doesn't move the needle a whole lot. And a big reason for that, Troy, is because it's delayed information. We're really talking now at the end of February about what happened in December. So the value of this report is more of it sets the stage or provides a baseline for the next reports coming up, and specifically that February cattle on feed report that's coming out next week. But the report I'm really looking for as far as setting the tone for 2019 is that cattle report that's coming out this week. That's the one that has the most potential to be to change expectations. Most expectations right now is that 2018 was a relatively flat year as far as total cattle inventory in the U.S. If there was anything outside of or too far away from that shows in the report, that could go a long ways into changing where we think we are in the cattle industry right now.
And finally, Josh, any marketing advice you have for our viewers today?
Yeah, so this time of year is a time of year when I really like to push risk management strategies. Springtime, or as we approach springtime anyway, that's usually when we find our price peaks for most of our cattle prices. And then we seasonally see prices go down through the summer and as we approach the fall months. So, think about what your 2019 plans are. You planning on buying, selling stockers, or retaining ownership throughout the feedlot maybe, or perhaps just wanting to get a better handle on what your feeding costs are at whatever stage you're in. This is a great time of year to sit down and evaluate your options, to try to plan for managing some of that price risk. And if you don't know where to start, or if there's just too much out there to consider, reach out to your state's University Extension Service. There's a lot of resources that are available out there, but this is something to keep in mind right now as we start thinking about what we want to do with our cattle production in 2019.
All right, Dr. Josh Maples, Mississippi State University, we appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Stay dry down there in Starkville, all right?
Thank you, Troy. Y'all stay warm up there.
Next week, we'll be joined by Iowa State University's Dr. Lee Schultz. We're taking your questions, so email us or get in touch with us on social media, and I'll pass your question along during the interview. Moving on now, and Del Fike has been a leader in the soil health movement in eastern Nebraska ever since he started investing more time in no-till and cover crops on his Pleasant Dale farm in the late 80s. Recently, however, he's shifted his focus to consulting and the widespread communal effects of practices like cover crops and high stock density grazing. That's the impetus of the consulting side of Fike Cattle Company called Soil for Hope. Read about Soil for Hope and how investing in soil health has paid off for Fike in the March Nebraska Farmer. It's time now for weather with Nebraska Extension ag climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. And Al, I know you've heard the old saying about March coming in like a lion. Have we got a roaring forecast this week?
Well, Troy, we have seen some pretty cold weather this last week, and of course the snow, and I hope that we actually see March come in like a lion and in like a lamb. I think we're all ready to take a significant break from this very cold weather. In fact, we are looking at top 10 coldest Februarys on record for a substantial portion of eastern Nebraska, and basically offsets all the warming we've seen for the first 2 months of the winter. But as we go through this week, and unfortunately we're going to deal with another storm system moving through the region, and on its heels we're going to see some more Arctic air come into our region. It does, although, look like this will be a fairly short-lived event before we start to see a break in the temperatures as we get into the midweek period and actually start to shoot to the freezing or slightly above the freezing mark before things come crashing down as we go later into the week. So as we look at the upper air models, the first wave of energy that was bringing the light snowfall to northern Nebraska, and we've seen two of these in a row, Thursday night and Friday night, is now moving to the east. We now have another wave to our south that is going to impact northern or southern Nebraska as we go through the overnight hours. We have low pressure down the Texas Panhandle. It's going to bring enough moisture northward to overrun the front, and we'll see accumulating snowfall in northern Kansas and southern Nebraska. And then that will rapidly push out toward the east, and we see this straight flow coming from the north. Here's our Arctic air moving in. Very chilly temperatures and a lot of wind. So we're looking at some extreme wind chills, a lot of blowing snow as we get into Sunday afternoon into Monday, and then the front pushes to the south of us. And as it pushes to the south of us, that keeps that reinforcing cold air over top of a deep snowpack. That means bitter temperatures continue into at least Monday and possibly through Tuesday. And then high pressure starts to slide to the southeast. At the surface, we do see a little bit of light flurry activity, but the main emphasis for storm activities in the western United States. And then we start to see some ridging trying to build into the region as we get into Tuesday. Got a slight northwest flow, so we will see some cool temperatures, but we should start to see some moderation from west to east as temperatures start to push back up in the 20s in far eastern Nebraska. Most of flurry activity remains to our north. And then as we get into the day on Wednesday, high pressure ridge firmly builds in the center part of the country. Southwest flow aloft brings warmer air into us, and we should break the freezing mark across a substantial portion of the southern half of Nebraska. Low pressure sits to our west, and we have a large storm system coming in the western United States, and it's going to take a few days to get into our region, so that's going to keep the flow primarily to the south of us, and we do have a blocking ridge to the north of us, so I don't expect it to see a lot of significant precipitation, but we will definitely see some warmer conditions as this low pressure starts to get organized. Most of the heavier precipitation should remain north of Nebraska, and then as we get on the day, on Friday, we get this zonal flow, a little bit of a trough moving out of the western Rockies, but the main action remains to our south, and we'll have to watch this low pressure in the Texas Panhandle as it wants to start to lift toward the north. So we are showing some accumulating snowfall, but I think this probably is going to sag a little bit farther south and impact more of southern and central Nebraska like previous storm systems. So be aware that we have another system coming in next weekend, but after that, conditions start to look a little bit more decent in terms of temperatures. So we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast. It takes us through next weekend's storm system. We still see the cool air in place, much below normal temperatures, but remember, our high should be in the mid 40s at this time of the year. So even if we're into the low 40s, we're still below normal. This would suggest that this entire period will be anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees below normal. And in terms of precipitation, of course, of that system ejecting out, we do see this increase in precipitation. But I will say that after this next storm system next week, the models have been consecutively running for about 5 days now with a very strong warm-up across the center part of the country. Troy, we hope that that falls into place.
Thanks, Al. For our final story today, Nebraska Extension is on the lookout for youth who love innovation and corn. The Innovative Youth Corn Challenge is in its 7th year and is open to the state's 4-H'ers and FFA members. The teams plant plots and, through the growing season, develop an innovative practice with the goal of getting a yield increase from that plot. And get this, some of the findings are even used in farmers' real-world decision-making.
Some of that data we are able to actually put with our Nebraska On-Farm Research Network, so that data is available for producers to see. And then we publish it, and producers are able to get a sense of some of the products that the youth are trying. And there's a lot of crop scouts and ag teachers also that kind of help the youth work with it in a mentoring capacity. So then they're able to kind of, we publish that information, so they're able to see what the youth are doing.
Korbin Kudera was part of the team that won first place in the 2018 challenge. He's a freshman agronomy major at UNL and has ambitions to help run the family farm after he graduates. He thinks this competition will give him the tools to eventually do that.
This competition lets me try out different things that might help on the family's farm. Like this year we did in-furrow fertilizer, a higher salt content, a lower salt. Just to see if the low salt would have less seed injury, and it actually ended up where that had a lower yield than the higher salt. But the check was somewhere in between, but it wasn't, neither of the in-furrow products were profitable this year. I'd encourage any 4-H or FFA member that's interested to do it. It's very educational to plan out a research project and carry it out throughout the year, and then analyze the yield data after it's all done.
Sign up for the 2019 Innovative Youth Corn Challenge is underway. Just head over to cropwatch.unl.edu, type Corn Challenge into the search bar, and submit your team name and contact information. You have until March 15th to sign up. Well, I have a cornfession. That's going to do it for this week's show. Hope to see you right back here next time. Until then, I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.